In 2015, a shop that had stood on the British High Street for 87 years was sold for a £1 coin. The buyer had been bankrupt 3 times and had never run a shop. The man selling it, Sir Philip Green, had already taken hundreds of millions of pounds out of the business and moved it to his family in Monaco. But here is the odd thing. When Green bought British Home Stores, it was profitable and its pension fund was in surplus. 13 months after that pound changed hands, it was gone. 11,000 people lost their jobs. 20,000 pensioners were left staring at a hole where their retirement used to be, a hole of £571 million, and the man at the centre of it kept his knighthood, kept his fortune, and kept his yacht. That yacht is worth remembering because it tells you where the money went. It is called Lionheart. It is around 90 metres long. It was delivered in 2016, the same year British Home Stores collapsed, and it is valued at roughly $150 million. While the pensioners of a British institution were being told their retirement would be cut, a brand new super yacht was being fitted out in the Mediterranean for the family that had owned them. Shops go out of fashion all the time, and that is not quite what happened here. Over 88 years, British Home Stores had become something close to permanent, a shop most British families had walked through at some point in their lives. Then, across a decade and a half, it was turned into a machine for moving cash to a tax haven, and that machine only stopped when there was nothing left to take. The thing that made British Home Stores worth buying was the very thing that killed it. To understand how far it fell, you first have to understand how ordinary it once was, and how completely it belonged to the country. For most of the 20th century, British Home Stores was simply there. It sat between the butcher and the building society on high streets in almost every town of any size. It was where you bought school uniforms and light bulbs and a cardigan for your mother and children's shoes and a cooked breakfast in the cafe upstairs. It was not glamorous. It never pretended to be. It was reliable, it was affordable, and it was everywhere, and being everywhere was the point. At its height, it ran 164 stores across the United Kingdom and another 74 abroad, spread across 18 different countries. For a British shopper, it was less a brand than a piece of furniture. You did not admire it. You just knew it would be there on the corner with the lights on. Its beginnings were far humbler than the empire it became, and far less British than the name suggested. British Home Stores opened its first shop in 1928 in Brixton, in South London, at 452 Brixton Road. The idea itself was an American import. It was set up by a group of American entrepreneurs who had watched Woolworths conquer the British High Street and wanted a piece of the same trade. The idea was blunt and clever. Woolworths sold everything at threepence or sixpence, nothing dearer. British Home Stores would do the same thing, but pitch itself slightly upmarket, capping its prices at 1 shilling, double what Woolworths charged. A shop where nothing cost more than a shilling. Within a year, the cap had already risen to 5 shillings because the customers kept coming and the model kept working. In December of that first year, a controlling share of the young company was bought by an American chain store operator named Abraham Neisner, who ran a string of variety stores back in New York. He became its chairman. He would not see where it led. He died at sea in December of 1933 aboard an ocean liner, and soon afterwards the American money sold out and went home. What was left behind was a British company with an American blueprint and a name that promised the nation itself. By 1933, the company had gone public, its shares trading on the London market. It grew the way solid retailers grew in those decades, quietly and steadily, one store at a time, through depression and war and the long grey recovery afterwards. It came into its own in the lean years that followed the war, when rationing was still a recent memory and every household counted its shillings, because a shop that sold decent plain goods at honest prices was exactly what a rebuilding country wanted. It opened in market towns and city centres alike, and it tended to take the same kind of spot in each of them, the middle of the parade on the busiest stretch, where the most feet passed in a day. By the end of the 1960s, it had around 94 shops and employed more than 12,000 people. It had become part of the furniture of British life, and it stayed that way for a generation. The sort of shop a family would visit without ever really thinking about it, so woven into ordinary life that nobody noticed it was there. It knew exactly what it was. It sat one careful rung below Marks and Spencer and the great names of the department store trade, and that was where it wanted to be, quality and value for money, aimed a little below the shoppers those grander stores chased, offering much the same sorts of goods for a few pounds less. For millions of families across the country, on wages that had to stretch, spending wisely was the whole appeal, and British Home Stores was built for exactly them. But a shop that lives by being the sensible middle of the market is a shop with nowhere to hide, on the day that someone cheaper and someone smarter both arrive at once. That day was still decades away. When it came, British Home Stores would have no answer for it. Then, in 1986, came the first sign that ordinary and reliable might not be enough. British Home Stores merged with the retail empire of the designer Terence Conran, the man behind Habitat and Mothercare, in a deal that created a new company called Storehouse. British Home Stores shareholders came out of it holding a little over half of the combined group, and for a moment the whole thing looked like the future of British retailing, a design-led company with taste and scale and ambition. Conran wanted to drag the dependable old chain up market, to give it taste. He gave it a new logo, a lowercase flourish. He gave it lighting and cookware and a certain design confidence. What he could not give it was a reason for younger shoppers to choose it over everyone else now competing for the same pound. The high street was getting crowded, and the chain was starting to look like a shop your parents liked. The Conran experiment never quite took. Through the 1990s, Storehouse struggled to make the pieces fit, and British Home Stores stayed what it had always been, underneath the new logo, the dependable middle of the market, quietly losing its shine, while flashier names took the customers who had the money to move up, and cheaper names took the ones who had to count every pound. Pressed from both directions at once, a shop like that fades slowly, a little more each year, until one day someone looks up and notices it has almost gone. By the end of the century, the company was drifting, still large, still national, still profitable enough, but tired and unloved by the city. The kind of business that gets described in the financial pages as underperforming. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of business a certain type of buyer looks for. Big enough to matter, cheap enough to seize, and carrying, hidden inside it, assets worth far more than the sleepy share price suggested. In May of the year 2000, that buyer arrived and bought British Home Stores out of the Storehouse group for himself. His name was Philip Green, and he was by the year 2000 one of the most talked about businessmen in Britain. He was a dealer, more than a builder, a buyer and seller of companies, a man with an extraordinary instinct for what a struggling retailer was really worth and how to get it for less. He was loud, he was combative, he threw famous parties, and he was on his way to becoming known, without irony, as the king of the high street. The price was around £200 million. At the time, it looked like a gamble on a fading name. In hindsight, it was one of the sharpest purchases of his career, because what he had bought only looked like a shop. Underneath, it was a business that still threw off cash, sitting on top of a valuable property portfolio and a pension fund, and priced as though none of that were true. That pension fund matters more than anything else in this story, so it is worth pausing on what it was. British Home Stores ran what is called a defined benefit scheme. The workers paid in over their careers, the company topped it up, and in return every member was promised a fixed income for the rest of their life once they retired. It is the gold standard of pensions, the kind that has all but vanished from British working life, and it only works if the fund behind it is kept healthy. When Green bought the company, that fund was in surplus. There was more money in it than it needed to keep all its promises. It was, in other words, one more asset he had just acquired, and like every other asset in the business, it would not stay healthy for long. For the first few years, it even looked like a rescue. Costs were cut, suppliers were squeezed, ranges were tightened. The tired old chain was made to sweat, and for a moment the numbers turned sharply upward. In the 2004 financial year, British Home Stores made an operating profit of more than £100 million. The king of the high street had touched the dependable old shop, and for a season made it gleam. This is the part of the story his defenders still point to, and they are not wrong to. For a few years he genuinely made it work. and then the extraction began. Between 2002 and 2004, the group that owned British Home Stores paid out £423 million in dividends. Set that number against what the business actually earned in the same period. Its after-tax profit came to £208 million. The company paid out to its owners more than twice what it made. The Parliamentary inquiry that later took the accounts apart found that of that £423 million, the Green family received £307 million directly. In 3 years, one family took out of a British high street shop more than that shop had earned, and then some. Here is the detail that turns a hard bargain into something colder. The money did not stay in Britain. The business was ultimately controlled through a company whose majority shareholder was Green's wife, Tina Green, and Tina Green was a resident of Monaco. On the dividends that flowed to her, no British tax was due. The profits of a shop that traded on nearly every British high street, staffed by British workers and built on British custom, were paid out to a shareholder living in a principality on the French Riviera where the income tax rate is 0. In 2005, that arrangement produced a single payment that the later inquiry described as the biggest paycheck in British corporate history. Green's wider retail group paid a dividend of £1.3 billion, most of it flowing to his Monaco-based wife. £1.3 billion in a single year, out of British retail and into a tax haven. Even among the very rich, it was a number that stopped people in their tracks. Set it beside the £200 million Green had paid for British Home Stores itself, and the shape of the whole operation comes into focus. In a single year, the family drew out more than 6 times what the entire high street chain had cost to buy. For the people who ran it this way, the shops mattered mostly as a place where cash was generated, gathered up, and sent somewhere better than a British high street. The pattern went deeper than dividends, because dividends alone were not the only way to move money out. Consider the arrangement made with the company's own shops. In 2001, 10 British Home Stores properties were sold for £106 million to a firm called Carmen Properties. Carmen Properties was based in Jersey, and it was ultimately owned by Tina Green. The shops did not change hands in any way a customer would notice. The same tills rang in the same buildings, but now the company was a tenant in its own stores paying rent. And over the years of that arrangement, it paid around £153 million in rent to a company owned by the family that owned it. When those same 10 shops were eventually sold back, they went for just £70 million. The family had bought the buildings, collected years of rent from the company for the use of them, and then handed them back for less than they paid, leaving British Home Stores poorer on every leg of the deal. This is what a sale and leaseback does when it is turned against the company it is meant to serve. A business that owns its own shops has something solid underneath it, an asset it can borrow against, sell in a crisis, or fall back on when trade is thin. Strip those buildings out into a separate company owned by the family, and the shop keeps trading exactly as before, but it now owns nothing and owes rent forever. Once the buildings are gone, there is far less holding anyone to the place, and walking away from what remains becomes a great deal easier. None of this was hidden in a back alley. In 2006, Philip Green was knighted for services to retail. The dealer had become, officially, a knight of the realm. He sat at the top of British business, feted by prime ministers, consulted by governments, photographed on the decks of ever larger boats. And beneath him, the shop that had made so much of it possible was being quietly stripped of the very things that had made it worth buying. And it all wore an air of complete respectability. The board of the family holding company that ultimately owned the chain was chaired for a time by a distinguished barrister and member of the House of Lords, Lord Grabina. The offshore property deals, the dividends, the payments that ended up in Monaco, none of it was done in the dark. It was signed off by eminent people in wood-panelled rooms, blessed by the honour system, and written up in the business pages as the work of a retail genius. For years, none of the people who might have asked hard questions about where the money was going had any reason to, because from the outside the whole enterprise had every appearance of a success, because that is what the property deals and the dividends really were. Every pound taken out was a pound not spent on the shops. While rivals were pouring money into refits, into their websites, Into the online future that was coming, whether the high street liked it or not, the company was being milked. Its stores grew shabby and its ranges grew dull. The reliable old chain that had survived depression and war was being asked year after year to hand over more than it earned, and to do it while the world of retail changed underneath it. And the timing of it could hardly have been worse, because these were the exact years the ground was shifting under every high street shop in the country. This was when Primark was teaching a generation to expect new clothes for the price of a sandwich, when the supermarkets were swallowing whole aisles of the middle market, and when a company called Amazon was quietly turning the whole idea of a shop into something you could do from your sofa. The retailers that survived the next decade were the ones that spent heavily and early on their stores and on their websites, bracing for a storm they could see coming. British home stores spent that decade being drained instead. It arrived at the great disruption of British retail with tired shops, a thin website, and its pockets already turned out. By the end, people would say it had simply fallen out of favour with shoppers. That was true enough as far as it went. It also left out the reason, which was that it had been given nothing left to win them back with. There was one more move worth noting, and it came in 2009. That year, Green sold British home stores again. This time he sold it, in effect, to himself, passing it to his own family's investment company for the same £200 million he had paid for it 9 years earlier, and folding it into his wider group of high street names. The sale changed almost nothing about who really controlled the shop. What it did was draw British home stores deeper into the family structure, the same structure through which the money kept flowing outward and upward, so that the fate of the old chain was now bound tightly to the fortunes of the whole empire around it. When that empire eventually fell, years later, British home stores would already be long gone, though the method that had hollowed it out would still be running right to the end. You can watch the damage in a single line of the accounts. When Green bought the company in the year 2000, its tangible fixed assets, the real physical worth of its shops and fittings, stood at around £430 million. By 2014, that figure had fallen to £183 million. The physical substance of the business had been more than halvered, and by then the profits had gone into reverse. From 2009 onward, British home stores lost money every single year. By 2014, the company that Green had bought as a profitable concern had negative net assets of more than £250 million, kept alive only by loans from the family that owned it. Add up the losses across those final years, and the scale of the hollowing becomes clear. From the point the profits turned, British home stores bled a cumulative operating loss of around £442 million by the time it was sold. The family that had taken hundreds of millions out in the good years was now lending money back in to keep the doors open, some £250 million of it, loans that would later simply be written off because there was nothing left to repay them with. The company had become a patient kept breathing by the same hands that had drained it, and the arithmetic no longer worked in anyone's favour. The king of the high street had a problem. The shop he had bought and drained for far more than he had paid for it was now worth less than nothing. It was losing money it did not have. Its pension fund, once comfortably in surplus, was sliding into a deficit that would eventually be measured in the hundreds of millions. And a business worth less than nothing, with a pension black hole attached, is a business almost impossible to sell. Almost. To sell a company nobody sensible would buy, you need a buyer who is not sensible. And in the autumn of 2014, one appeared. The story of that buyer begins, strangely, with another man entirely. Green's advisors had first been in talks about selling British home stores to a man named Paul Sutton. Paul Sutton was a convicted fraudster. When his history became too awkward to ignore and the talks with him collapsed, they did not collapse entirely, because standing just behind Sutton, working alongside him, was a man who had begun as little more than Sutton's driver and junior associate. His name was Dominic Chappell, and when Sutton fell away, Chappell simply stepped forward into his place. It is worth being precise about who Dominic Chappell was, because he came to the deal with none of the qualifications it demanded. He was a former racing driver. He had no experience of running a shop, let alone a national chain employing thousands, and he had been declared bankrupt not once, not twice, but 3 times. This was the man to whom one of Britain's best-known retailers was about to be handed. In March of 2015, the deal was done. Sir Philip Green sold British Home Stores, all of it, the shops, the staff, the pension scheme, the 87 years of history, to Dominic Chappell's company for £1. The company was called Retail Acquisitions, a name that suggested rather more experience than the man behind it possessed. To sweeten the handover, £10 million was put into the business as part of the arrangement, but the headline price, the figure that would follow this story forever, was £1 single, and it was not only a shop that changed hands. The pension scheme went with it, deficit and all. 20,000 people's retirements passed across a table to a company controlled by a thrice bankrupt former racing driver, as though they were part of the stock. The professionals who might have raised a hand and stopped it, the advisors and directors who knew exactly who Chappell was and exactly what state the business was in, did not stop it. They took their fees and let it through. Think about what that price really admitted. When Green bought the company, he had paid £200 million for it. 15 years later, he could not give it away for more than a coin. The years in between had hollowed it out completely. The whole thing, the entire national institution, was now worth precisely nothing, and its new owner would take it on only because it came with that £10 million attached and the hope of stripping out more. Later, when members of Parliament came to examine how this had been allowed to happen, they did not soften their words. They found that British Home Stores had been, in their phrase, hurriedly sold to a manifestly unsuitable buyer, a man Green knew perfectly well to be a former bankrupt with no retail experience. The people who ran the company were sold, along with the building and the stock, to someone with no plausible means of saving them, and everyone at the top who signed off on it knew. What happened over the next 13 months was a second round of the same extraction, faster and cruder, run this time by a man with far less to lose. Chappell's company took payments out of the company worth as much as £25 million in just over a year, in fees, in interest and in money, routed to firms connected to him. A company that was already dying was made to hand over what little strength it had left. The details, when they came out, read like farce, if farce could bankrupt 11,000 people. At one point, Chappell tried to charge flights for a family holiday to the Bahamas to the company's travel budget. The chief executive of British Home Stores, a man named Darren Top, who had been brought in to try to save the thing, refused to authorise it. Chappell's response, according to the evidence Top later gave to Parliament, was to take a hardship payment out of the company instead. A hardship payment from a firm he was steering toward the rocks, after his holiday to the Bahamas was declined. Top's account of working under Chappell was extraordinary. He told members of Parliament that he had come to believe Chappell had, in his words, his fingers in the till, and he testified that when he confronted Chappell over a transaction involving £1.5 million that had been moved out of the business, Chappell threatened to kill him. This was the state of the company in its final months, a dying institution being emptied by a man who had threatened to murder the executive trying to protect it. By the spring of 2016, there was nothing left to empty, and so the reckoning began. First it came for the 11,000 people who worked there, then for the 20,000 whose pensions hung in the balance, and in the end, slowly and never quite completely, it came for the man who had set the whole thing in motion. On the 25th of April 2016, British Home Stores went into administration. The administrators, a firm called Duff & Phelps, were sent in to do the one thing that was still possible, which was to find someone, anyone, willing to buy the company as a going concern and keep the lights on. For weeks they tried, and they found no one. On the 2nd of June, they announced that the search had failed and that the whole chain would be wound down. Every shop would close. The man overseeing the administration put it plainly, and his words are worth hearing, because they are the closest thing this story has to an official epitaph. He said the high street was changing, that these were turbulent times for retailers, and that British Home Stores had fallen as another victim of the seismic shifts the trade was living through. It was true as far as it went. The high street really was changing. Online shopping really was rising. Cheaper rivals really were taking the mid-market apart. All of that was real, but no seismic shift had reached into the accounts and paid a family in Monaco more than the company earned. That part was a choice. The closures rolled out across the summer of 2016, like a slow tide going out. The administrators warned that around 8,000 people directly employed by the company were likely to lose their jobs, and that another 3,000 working in the stores for other firms were at risk too. 11,000 livelihoods, give or take, attached to a name that had felt permanent. Store by store, the sales began, the famous fixtures sold off, the shelves stripped, the staff working out their last shifts under signs promising everything must go. The final shops closed their doors in late August. Across the country that month, staff who had worked 10, 20, 30 years for the company found themselves marking down the last of the stock, selling off the very shelves and rails and mannequins they had dressed 1,000 times, and handing back their keys to landlords who would soon be looking for someone new. The very last British home stores of them all, in the St Enoch Centre in Glasgow, pulled down its shutters on the 28th of August 2016. 88 years after a small shop had opened in Brixton promising nothing dearer than a shilling, the last British home stores in the country switched off its lights for good. It was the biggest failure the British High Street had seen since Woolworths itself had collapsed 8 years earlier, taking 800 shops and around 30,000 staff down with it. Two of the great permanent seeming names of the 20th century High Street, the two shops that had between them taught the country how to buy cheaply and well, gone inside a decade of each other. The high street people had grown up with was disappearing in real time, and British Home Stores was the largest single piece of it to fall, and the wreckage reached far beyond the shop floor. When the accounts were finally added up, British Home Stores owed more than £1.3 billion, spread across over 1,200 separate creditors. Around 358 million of that was owed to landlords, the owners of the buildings, left holding empty units in towns up and down the country. Something like 48 million more was owed to suppliers, and many of those were small firms, family businesses that had shipped their goods to a trusted national name in good faith and would now never be paid for them. A single collapse rolled outward through hundreds of other companies, each with its own workers and its own bills and its own promises to keep, every one of them made to absorb a share of the loss. British Home Stores did not fall quietly, and it did not fall alone, and the bill for its failure would still be landing on strangers years after the last shop went dark. And then there was the pension fund, the wound that would not close, the part of the story that reached past the shop floor and into old age. That healthy surplus Green had inherited was long gone. By the time the company collapsed, the fund carried a deficit of £571 million, measured against what it would cost to secure everyone's promised pension in full. Around 20,000 people, current and former staff, had paid into it across their working lives and were counting on it, and now it could not pay what it had promised. These were ordinary working people, shop assistants and warehouse workers and cafe staff and store managers, people who had spent decades of their working lives inside British Home Stores on the understanding that the pension at the end was safe. Many of them now faced retiring on less than they had been promised, some of them years from being able to make up the difference, all of them watching from the outside as the people who had owned them took delivery of a new yacht. The company was gone, the jobs were gone, and the promise made to 20,000 ordinary people had been broken. The question everyone in the country was now asking was the obvious one, and it was about to be asked in the one place Sir Philip Green could not simply walk away from. In the summer of 2016, two committees of the House of Commons joined forces to find out exactly what had been done to British Home Stores and who had done it. One was the Work and Pensions Committee, chaired by the veteran Member of Parliament Frank Field. The other was the Business, Innovation and Skills Committee, chaired by Ian Wright. They took evidence from executives, from advisors, from Chappell, and eventually from Sir Philip Green himself, who sat before them for hours and gave as good as he got, combative and unrepentant, a man plainly unused to being questioned as though he might be in the wrong. The report they published on the 25th of July 2016 was one of the most damning documents Parliament had ever produced about a private businessman. It described what had been done to the company as the systematic plunder of British Home Stores, and it reached for a phrase that would attach itself to Philip Green for the rest of his life. His conduct, the report said, was the unacceptable face of capitalism. It was a phrase built to travel, and travel it did, onto front pages and into headlines and news bulletins across the country, until the words were tied to his name in the public mind, more firmly than the knighthood ever had been. For a man who had spent 30 years building his own legend, that was the description that stuck to him hardest. The committees were careful about blame, and their care matters, because the truth here has more than one author. They found that Green, Chappell, and the various directors, advisors, and, as they put it, hangers-on around them, were all culpable. Chappell had plundered what was left. The advisors had waved through a sale that should never have happened. But the report left no doubt where the heaviest responsibility lay. The man who had bought a healthy company, drained it for more than it was worth, and then sold it for £1 to a manifestly unsuitable buyer to get the problem off his own books, was Sir Philip Green. Green did not take it quietly. He did not apologise. He insisted over and over that he had put money into British home stores rather than drained it, telling the committee and anyone else who would listen that he had ploughed as much as £800 million of his own into the business across his 15 years of ownership. The members weighed that claim against the accounts in front of them, the dividends out, the rent out, the assets falling year on year, and they did not accept it. Then he attacked the inquiry itself. He demanded that Frank Field resign from it, accusing him of setting out to destroy his reputation. He called the report the predetermined and inaccurate output of a biased and unfair process. The King of the High Street, faced with the plainest possible account of what he had done, chose to argue with the referee. The country was not persuaded. On the 20th of October 2016, the House of Commons did something it had never done before. Members of Parliament debated whether Sir Philip Green should be stripped of his knighthood, and they voted, without a single voice against, to call on the honours authorities to take it away. In the chamber, he was called a billionaire spiv. He was compared to Robert Maxwell, the media tycoon who had raided his own workers' pension fund a generation earlier. It was an extraordinary humiliation. A nation's parliament formally asking that a man be unknighted for what he had done to a shop. But a vote in the Commons was only words, and a report, however damning, could not put a single pound back into an empty pension fund. The real question, the one the 11,000 and the 20,000 actually cared about, was still unanswered. Whether Sir Philip Green would ever pay for what had happened, and whether anyone at all would face a court, and whether that yacht in the Mediterranean would ever cost its owner a single thing. The money came first, and it came slowly. For a year, Green insisted he had done nothing that required him to pay anything, while the pressure built in the press, in Parliament, and from the pensions regulator, which had the power to pursue him through the courts. In February of 2017, he finally settled. He agreed to pay up to £363 million toward the pension scheme, a cash payment of £343 million and further sums on top. It was, by any measure, an enormous cheque. A new independent pension scheme was set up, and around 19,000 members ended up with better retirement benefits than they would have received had the funds simply been dumped into the national safety net for collapsed pensions. It sounded, at last, like justice. It was more complicated than that. The settlement was a far better outcome than the members would otherwise have faced, and yet it did not make everyone whole, and the way it was structured meant that some of the best paid former managers gained the most from it. And buried in the arrangement was a detail almost too neat to believe. Because of the way the lump sum options worked, Sir Philip Green himself stood to receive a refund of as much as £15 million out of the very money he had paid in. Even his act of restitution had a return built into it. For Dominic Chappell, the reckoning was harder, and it is still going on. The pensions regulator pursued him for millions, issuing demands against him worth around £9.5 million, and fining him separately for failing to hand over the information it asked for. He was banned from acting as a company director for 10 years, and then the criminal courts took an interest, not in the collapse itself, but in what he had done with the money he pulled out along the way. In November of 2020, Dominic Chappell was convicted of cheating the public revenue. He had failed to pay tax on more than £2 million of income that had flowed through a company of his called Swiss Rock, dodging more than £580,000 owed to the state. He was sent to prison for 6 years. He did not stay there. He was released on parole toward the end of 2023, having served half his sentence. Within months, he was back inside. In March of 2024, he was returned to prison for breaching the terms of his release, after going into business setting up restaurants with the celebrity chef Marco Pierre White and his son. The man who had bought a national institution for £1 could not, it seemed, stay out of trouble for a single year. And the courts were not finished with the directors either. In 2024, in a civil case brought by the administrators, the High Court delivered the largest judgment of its kind in British history. 2 former directors were found liable for what the law calls wrongful trading, for carrying on when they should have known the game was up, and were made jointly responsible for compensation of just over £110 million. It was the first time an English court had ever made such a finding under that heading, and the largest wrongful trading award the country had ever seen. Chappell himself, in a related ruling, was found liable to pay at least £50 million. The judge said he had taken the opportunity to plunder the group as and when he could, £50 million demanded by a court from the man who had bought the whole company for a single one. And Sir Philip Green himself came through it remarkably intact. He kept his knighthood. For all the fury of that unanimous Commons vote, the committee with the actual power to strip an honour never acted, and quietly, over the years that followed, the matter was allowed to drop. He is still, to this day, Sir Philip Green. His wider empire did not survive him for long though. In the closing weeks of 2020, his group of high street names, Topshop and Burton and Dorothy Perkins among them, collapsed into administration too, carrying its own pension deficit, 4 years almost to the season after British home stores had gone the same way. His fortune shrank. He had once been worth close to £5 billion. By 2019, he had dropped out of the ranks of Britain's billionaires altogether. But he remained, and remains, a very wealthy man, living the life the money had bought, at a comfortable distance from the wreckage. So what is left now of British home stores? If you go looking for it on the high street today, you will mostly find absence. The shops are still there, the big double-fronted units in the middle of every town, but they wear other names now, or no name at all. Some have been carved up into smaller units, a discount chain here, a mobile phone shop there. Some have become gyms. A good few of them, years on, still stand empty, their upper floors dark, the ghost of the old lettering sometimes just visible on the stonework above the newer signs, if you know to look for it. Go back to where it all began, to 452 Brixton Road, the address of that first shilling shop from 1928, and you will find a branch of Superdrug. The flagship on Oxford Street in London, once one of the busiest shops in the country, has had part of its great floor space reborn as a food hall, one of the largest in the country, where Londoners now queue for street food on the spot where they once queued for cardigans. Another of its grand London buildings, near Oxford Circus, stood empty for years and is being redeveloped into offices and shops and event space, its retail life over for good. The name itself did not quite die. In 2018, a couple of years after the collapse, a lighting company bought the right to use it and quietly relaunched British Home Stores as an online shop, selling lamps and bedding and homeware over the internet, a website wearing the name of a chain that had once filled the high street. There are no aisles, no cafe, no children's shoes, no cardigans for your mother. There is a logo and a checkout page, and in one improbable corner of the world, a single physical shop still trades under the old British Home Stores sign, thousands of miles from Brixton, in a shopping mall in Doha, in Qatar. 88 years, 164 British shops, and this is what remains that still carries the name, a website, and one outlet in the Gulf. The pensioners are still here too, of course, the 20,000, older now, most of them drawing the retirement that the settlement salvaged from the wreck. They did far better in the end than they might have. They are not, most of them, ruined, but nor are they made whole in the way a promise is supposed to make you whole, and every one of them spent a stretch of their later life not knowing whether the money they had worked for would be there. That long stretch of not knowing was its own kind of damage, and a settlement cheque, however large, cannot refund the years a person spends afraid. And Sir Philip Green is where he has been for years, on the water, in the sun, aboard Lionheart or one of the boats before it, at a comfortable distance from the empty shops and the salvaged pensions, and the courtrooms full of other people's names. He paid in the end more than he ever wanted to. He did not pay everything. He kept the title, he kept the fortune, and he kept the yacht that this whole story was, in a sense, always about. Which brings us back to that £1 coin, the price of a national institution, the smallest sum in the whole enormous ledger, and somehow the one that says the most. When Philip Green bought British Home Stores, it was a profitable company that had stood for 72 years and looked after the retirement of its staff. He treated the thing that made it valuable, its cash, its property, its pension surplus, as his to take, and he took it, until the healthy company he had bought was a husk worth a coin. The high street did change, and it would have tested British Home Stores whoever had owned it. But the deeper tragedy runs past that. A company can be perfectly alive and profitable and 80 years into a good long life and still be worth more to the right owner dead than alive. That is the whole of it. A shop that opened in Brixton promising nothing dearer than a shilling and closed in Glasgow 88 years later, having been sold in between for £1. If this story stayed with you, there is another one waiting on your screen right now, and I think it is going to stay with you too.